Previously on Kentucky Case Files. In a surprising turn of events, Steve Nunn, a former state legislator and son of a powerful ex-governor, confessed to murdering his former fiancée Amanda Ross in Lexington and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Now we turn our attention to the victim's legacy. I'm Emily Steele.
And I'm Marcus Roland. This is Kentucky Case Files, the Steve Nunn Case, Part 3, Legacy and Change.
Let's start with some startling statistics about domestic violence, or intimate partner violence, as it's often called. In the United States, according to the NIA project at the Emory University School of Medicine, 85% of intimate partner violence victims are women. A woman is beaten every 9 seconds. Every year, nearly 5.1 million incidences of IPV occur among U.S. women aged 18 and older. Despite severe underreporting, calls related to IPV make up about half of all violent crime calls to police departments, which is particularly stunning if you think about the fact that domestic violence is severely underreported because of the shame and stigma around it. IPV results in nearly 1,300 deaths and 2 million injuries every year. And more than 3 women are killed by husbands or boyfriends every day. On September 11th, 2009, Amanda Ross was one of them. In the wake of tragedy, Ross's mother, Diana, turned grief into action. Being no stranger to the Kentucky political system, she lobbied for tougher laws to protect domestic violence victims like her daughter, and she was successful.
Here's Diana Ross speaking to the media in 2010.
I hope that nobody has to go through what I did. Losing a daughter or a son is very traumatic. I don't think we realize the losses out there until we suffer one ourselves.
Soon, politicians in Frankfort drafted what would become known as Amanda's Law, a measure aimed at strengthening protections for victims of domestic violence by introducing GPS monitoring and expanding protective orders. Here's Darlene Thomas, the executive director of Greenhouse 17, an advocacy agency committed to ending intimate partner abuse.
What, in your opinion, were the systemic failures that resulted in Amanda's death, even in light of having the DVO on Steve Nunn?
Well, that's a really good question because there's still unanswered components to this, right? So she had a protective order, but she also, I feel like Amanda did, short of leaving and fleeing and never coming home, right? Where she had a job and friends and a family and her own aspirations, that probably wasn't the most feasible thing, just to run away. Even though Miss Ross, I think, offered, "Can't we just run away for a little while together?" She did not do that. But beyond that, she had the resource. She lived in a gated community. So if there was a failure in anything, I think sometimes we fail to recognize how seriously lethal and dangerous domestic violence is. And so she got a protective order. If I recall correctly, I do think that there were some violations of the protective order that she did make known to the county attorney at that time, but not at the level of necessarily prosecuting for violations. So in hindsight, what might have seemed very minimal contact and not necessarily going to rise to the occasion of getting somebody to prosecute him and put him in jail. In hindsight, you realize that all those little small violations were his way of saying nobody's going to stop me from the choice he made to take her life. I think that was clear to her. I don't know that the system understood how clear it was to Amanda, because Amanda told people, "He is going to kill me. It's not going to matter what you do. He is going to kill me." Her work offered to take her home and escort her and change things. And she goes, "It won't matter." I think hindsight tells us things, right? Pay attention to small violations, because if they'll walk through, by making contact or texting or whatever, then they clearly don't have any respect for the court's order. But so many of these cases don't end in lethality. the courts then are left to discern what does lethality look like. I do think our legislators felt very betrayed and felt like they had to do something because one of their own or former owns had taken this action. It's hard. And it was somebody they knew and they knew the Ross family. So the Ross family is very politically active as well. And and I just felt our legislators felt like they needed to do something to support Miss Ross. They couldn't bring Amanda back, but maybe they can make it better for other families. I can remember standing at back of the funeral home, and I remember the legislators just grabbing me, going, "We got to have a bill. We've got to do better. We have to protect." And as an advocate, I'm just like, we got to breathe. Like we need to make sure that we don't have just a knee jerk reaction to what happened. We need to have some really thoughtful presence about what could improve the system. And so I do think the intention was to improve service, and they did welcome the voices of victim advocates, which was really helpful.
In the bill introduced by House Speaker Greg Stumbo, a Democrat from Prestonburg, judges could mandate GPS, that is, ankle monitoring, for anyone named in an emergency or domestic violence protective order. Victims could get electronic warnings if their abuser got too close to them. Plus, it called for several procedural steps, including criminal history reviews. The intent was admirable and necessary, and it was successfully signed into law in 2010, but as often happens in the legislative process, not in its original form. The Amanda's Law that emerged in 2010 after Governor Steve signed it was very different from what was first proposed. The original version sought a proactive two-way GPS alert system tied to rigorous risk evaluation. The final enacted law ended up representing a more cautious violation-based approach, largely reactive rather than preventative.
The original bill contained structured procedures, risk assessments prior to hearings, court-mandated criminal history reviews, and county attorney involvement at the hearings.
Darlene Thomas.
I do think it got lost a little bit sometimes and how it actually got implemented down the road, but the intention was good. I think there was this thought that if you had a protective order, if he was forced to be put on a GPS monitor, let's say, then that way she would have known where he was, or if he broke the boundaries of that GPS. But there was nothing in place that would have necessarily allowed that through the protective order. Where in the law that was then added, you could have GPS. Now, the downside of that is that it required a violation that rose to a criminal offense. And you would have to show the court and go back to appeal to the court why he or she should have to wear an ankle bracelet or be monitored for their whereabouts. Little harder to prove. I don't believe it's been a utilized part of the law at all, even though if there were a way for survivors or for those that do harm to have to be monitored, I do think survivors would be a lot safer. It's just not a system that's being used.
I've read comments from other advocates, and I think even from you from that time, that law as it came into force may not have at all protected Amanda.
I think given Amanda's situation, that particular component of GPS probably wouldn't have, because there was no violation. Therefore, she would not have been able to benefit. Now, they did recognize there were cases where that did occur, but I do believe it's totally underutilized. We have many cases where there are substantial violations, where often that part of the law is not being instituted that could add protections.
Judges are not even required to use GPS monitoring, and no statewide infrastructure or funding was established to allow consistent application.
Reasons given for the original bill being trimmed down were concerns raised about, one, constitutional due process rights. Mandating monitoring without any violation might violate privacy or be premature. Two, cost and administrative complexity. Counties worried that a broad GPS mandate without funding would be impossible to implement. And three, as a compromise to gain bipartisan support, the bill was scaled back to focus solely on monitoring after violations rather than preventative tracking. I think that these three reasons in this specific legislation really hit at the major concerns that lawmakers are confronting anytime they introduce policy, right? One concern is going to be the constitutionality. So a lot of lawmakers are anticipating down the road challenges to the constitutionality of the legislation. It can prevent them from maybe pushing the envelope in that regard, right? In anticipation that the law might be struck down and found unconstitutional. The issue of unfunded mandates is a perennial challenge, right? That especially state and local level on the ground bureaucratic structures that implement policy, but there's going to be pushback, right? If you're making us do things with technology, but you're not building into the legislation the funding to provide that technology, then it becomes an unfunded mandate and you'll get a lot of resistance from folks around that issue. I'm curious, this last one though, so the need for bipartisan support, obviously, most places, unless you have a really dominant majority of one party or the other, you're going to need to make some compromises to get a majority vote of legislators on board. But it's interesting in this case that the idea of preventative tracking was not palatable across partisan lines. And it's not actually immediately obvious to me which political party would have more of a consistent opposition to the notion of providing this kind of preventative tracking. In general, yeah, this is a tale of as old as time of policymaking, right? Where someone comes in with a really, what feels like a really great common sense idea. There's often this gap between people having this piece of paper that is meant to protect them and the actions of people involved, right? In this case, violations of that protective order. And this was meant to solve that problem, right? Here's a way that we could better monitor potential violations and hopefully deter. If you have an ankle monitor, you probably know that someone's going to know if you violate it, and so you might be more cautious around that. So to provide a kind of deterrent effect seems very common sense, but it runs into these challenges. There are always considerations around constitutional rights to due process, to privacy, and again, the matter of the cost. And I think this bill was particularly innovative in terms of its thoughts about how technology might be leveraged and not
Sure.
technology that was being used, right? People have house arrest ankle bracelet. That's a technology that's been used. So this is just adapting it to a different problem. But think back to the statistics I just read you about the prevalence of domestic violence and think about how quickly the number of EPOs among people with criminal histories, among people with the kinds of criteria that would get them flagged for this, how quickly that the costs from that kind of a system could mount. And unless the legislature is also willing to allocate the funding to support that, it's going to be a tough sell. Amanda's Law was a well-intentioned and emotional response to a horrific murder, and it broke ground by introducing GPS monitoring into the realm of dealing with domestic violence and expanding protective orders, but it has largely failed to live up to its promise. Since its enactment 15 years ago, the law has rarely been used. According to data from the Kentucky Administrative Office of the Courts, there have been only 2 instances of judges ordering GPS tracking under the statute. Officials cite reasons such as high cost and lack of funding, patchy technology, and lack of judicial training. Domestic violence advocates say it's due to inconsistent enforcement, judicial reluctance, and a lack of willpower by elected officials. Here's Darlene Thomas.
We just don't hear it being utilized the way it could be. And I don't know why. I don't know if it's because of cost or survivors aren't asking for it or prosecutors aren't helping push for it. Or, we have a lot of new family law judges that's just not been a part of their practice necessarily.
And honestly, I think everyone's right in this case. Some states, including Florida and Connecticut, have adopted stronger versions of Amanda's Law. Many advocates think Kentucky's version, the one that started it all, should be revisited and strengthened to truly protect victims. Still, Amanda's Law can be considered a success in that it got the conversation started and drew attention to violent domestic crime. Not until SB 271 was voted into law in 2022 was the first formal statewide reporting system created. That law requires data compilation and reporting on domestic violence fatalities and occurrences of dating or domestic violence and abuse. Here's Darlene Thomas.
We finally got that law changed in Kentucky, where we were really trying to track homicides, which was important because when we were trying to do Amanda's Law, we didn't have numbers. You couldn't tell, if there was a deceased victim, but they didn't know who the murderer was. I mean, then the cause of death was by, let's say, shooting. But if 2 months later they arrested the boyfriend, there was no way to show that it was domestic violence related or intimate partners related. And so we've tried to correct that in Kentucky law, how it gets documented. And now the state police are trying to track and go back actual homicides in the state. But that came from Amanda too, because I think what happened to Amanda showed the gaps for survivors. The protective order is a tool. It is not the answer to all safety. You got to have the multitudes of tools in order to have victim safety. And one piece of it is not the answer. You've got to look at the whole picture. And protective orders, the criminal courts are not the only answer. Protective orders are not the only answer. Monitoring is not the only answer, but a combination of those things could really aid the victim's safety.
Ross's legacy also led to the creation of a resource called Amanda Center in 2012. Housed on the first floor of the Fayette County District Courthouse in downtown Lexington, the center offers a 24/7 central location for victims of domestic violence to file emergency petitions, speak to authorities, and get connected with help. Victims can get a free emergency cell phone and charger that will allow them to call 911 at any time. Amanda Center is run by the Fayette County Sheriff's Department.
Mark, this case, although it's been some time now, really does bring to mind some quite recent incidents in Lexington.
Yes. There was recently an incident involving a guy who was scheduled for a hearing in an emergency protective order case. A couple of days before he was supposed to appear in court, he went on a shooting spree in Lexington, shooting a state trooper, several people at a church. And it really has some parallels here in terms of what happened and what could have happened. Fortunately, the petitioner in this more recent case was in such fear that she went to a friend's house and was able to avoid being harmed or killed by him.
And I think that's something that is so important to recognize about domestic violence. There are the tragedies, of course, of the multiple victims who are murdered as a result of domestic violence daily, but it can have broader societal consequences for violence. A study done in 2021 actually looked at instances of mass shootings in the United States, and the time period they were looking at was just 2014 to 2019. But of all of those mass shooting incidents, 70% of the shooters were either killing one or more family members as an outgrowth of domestic violence disputes, or they themselves had a history of domestic violence, even if they were killing people who weren't their intimate partners. So there's clearly, this, when we talk about the costs of implementing more stringent domestic violence legislation, I think it's important to recognize that we might like to think that the benefits of protecting victims like Amanda should be enough to motivate that investment in more stringent legislation around domestic violence. But even if that's not enough, to think that people who have nothing to do with these relationships might themselves end up as shooting victims as an outgrowth of domestic dispute, certainly I think suggests that it's not just a private matter, right? It's really something for the public to grapple with.
Once again, here's Darlene Thomas. What gives you hope after decades of working with survivors?
Oh, well, there's lots of things, but the true hope is for me is the resilience and the strength of the people that had been blessed to serve, right? Because they remind us every day if we have diligence and we can show them what it means to walk alongside them in a journey that's not often safe and often terrifying, but there is a way through it, and how they come through it is much more than what happened to them, to me, is always hopeful. And I'm still, after all these years, I've worked really hard, but after all these years of this work, I really do believe even our legislature and our judiciary and the people that are enforcing the law really do want to do the right things. And that's always hopeful to me. Do they always? I don't know that I would always agree with it, but I would say their intent was often good. And I can work with intent, and that as long as we can have communication. And the thing I appreciate about Amanda's Law is they did allow victims' voices at the table. And so I find that encouraging. Our legislature often does invite us to the table, even if we don't agree sometimes about gun laws, So SPD advocates really struggle with very few restrictions on abusers having access to guns.
If you could give 3 pieces of advice to those suffering from domestic violence, what would they be?
Trust your instincts. Actions speak much louder than words, meaning that the person can tell you all kinds of untruths about yourself or what you're enduring, but their actions, what they say doesn't match their action, then it's abusive, right? So to trust your instincts in that. And to say that break the silence, but do it safely. Call a crisis line, a trusted friend, family member, because secrets harm yourself even further and your kids. And you all deserve better than that.
Thank you for joining us on Kentucky Case Files.
If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-SAFE. There is help, and there is hope. And if you want to advocate for better laws to protect domestic violence victims, contact your local legislators. The simplest way to get contact information is to simply Google, "How do I contact my state representative?"
Next time on Kentucky Case Files, he was the flashy lawyer with billboards, TV ads, and a $600 million fraud scheme. We unravel the rise and fall of the appropriately named Eric C. Kahn.
Sourcing for this podcast came from our independent reporting, as well as the Lexington Herald Leader, the Louisville Courier Journal, Bowling Green Daily News, the New York Times, Kentucky Educational Television, Wave 3 News, WLKY, WKYT, NBC News, ABC News, CBS News, the news programs 2020 and 48 Hours, Louisville Public Media, and BehindTheBlueWall.blogspot.com. Special thanks to the hosts of Murder Police Podcast for their assistance.